This is the Holstein Cemetery on Bull Creek in Boone County, outside of Madison, about 15 or 20 minutes. And somewhere in this cemetery, according to a book we found written in the 70s, are buried many members of Billy Aggins and mine and many others, Gillespie family. Unfortunately, the book said that they were located by the road, and there are no marked graves here for Gillespies, even though the book said that there was. There are some old stones, however, in the cemetery. But of course they're not marked, they're just rocks. This is the older section of the cemetery where the Gillespies should be buried. But none of the stones are marked, so we can't tell for sure.
Did they have a different road up through here? No, I said did they?
Bird right beside him. And in the 19 and about 79 radio, whenever he put this book out, the box stone one you could still read real good and everything.
Yeah.
It was like just a regular cemetery, funeral home stone. Mm-hmm. Somebody come and put one up. But if we can't, I can't find it. So.
Looking up toward the cemetery from the road, Billy and I are really impressed by this terrain. It looks like some kind of an earthworks here. We don't know what's going on. It's kind of spooky down here. The terrain, the way it's laid out, is very odd. Because there's evidence of humans being here, like trash, garbage, and stuff, but at the same time there's these mounds or something, and then notice how the earth here begins to gradually slope down off of the hill. Real odd looking. Then of course there's this tree that we find, and maybe a deer was butting around on it. We may have found a little deer scent over there. We don't know what's going on, but just kind of weird here. Especially that mound or whatever it is right there. We think that looks kind of peculiar, but the works goes all the way around, and we don't know why. Just kind of interesting right here by the cemetery where the Gillespies are supposed to be. That's why we're over in here, is looking for them, but we don't think they're going to be found. Then of course there's the nice garbage stuff. The occasional crow calling. It's kind of scary, but hey. It's weird. Very weird here. And I'm getting out of here now. I'll look at the earthworks. Again, it's not as effective from over here, but when you're down in it, it sure is. It's almost like they've built a fort or something here. We don't know. Not that noticeable from here, though. Maybe you can see the slope better.
Southern Appalachian Coal Company.
But that Bull Creek must be
Yeah, I
4
think
miles
part of
long.
it's the one that's part
Well,
of it.
how do you? I don't want to go there, but how do you get it when you do want to go?
Well, you can't get in there. They got the gates locked.
Oh, so Bull Creek's
At the Gillespie Cemetery, it's a newer one, in the town called Emmons. On the other side of the creek, or river here, is what they used to call Gillespie. Gillespie has a lot of bottoms to it, whereas Emmons seems to be kind of mountainous. But this is on the Emmons side of the creek or river. Kind of interesting. Gillespie's buried over here. Anyway, we'll look around. Last look at the Gillespie cemetery. Not really very many Gillespies here, unless a lot of these Pauleys and Grayleys and Stones are all people who had Gillespie blood in them one way or another. But there's not a lot of Gillespies here at all. We're in Harts at the mouth of the Harts Creek, Big Harts Creek at the Harts Bridge, up on the hill from the old Al Brumfield home. This is the grave of Alan and Paulina Dingus Brumfield. Al's birth date should read 1860. But we're up here looking for Gillespies right now, so we aren't going to spend a lot of time on the Brumfields. And we don't have any Gillespies buried here, we don't think. But James Toney, who married a Gillespie and was Al Brumfield's grandpa, is buried up here. That's pretty much of a given. In a sinkhole here is the final resting place of James Toney and maybe his wife, but we think she's buried on Little Heart, Nancy Gillespie. About 2 graves down off the hill from George Brumfield's grave. This fella came here and settled around 1843. Another look at James Toney's last resting place, we think, according to Pat Aggins, who was, I think, told by Hendricks Brumfield. Or maybe Red Earl, Brumfield, Hendricks' boy. And this grave is located, again, 2 graves down off the hill from George Brumfield about. We can't tell if there might be a few more in between, but it's definitely right up behind the grave of Imogene Brumfield, daughter of May and Tom Brumfield. Location of the old Al Brumfield home at the mouth of Harts, which is now burned. The Harts Tavern there on the right. Route 10 running across the Wyandotte River. Looking down upon Harts from the Al Brumfield Cemetery. November 25th, 1995. The previous Gillespie footage in Boone County was on November 24th, 1995. Looking down at the town of Harts. Quiet pastoral village from the Al Brumfield Cemetery. And we seem to have a nice big tree limb blocking everything, so we'll relocate. Harts, a small but somewhat rowdy place at times. Always exciting and interesting. Harts Fire Station, where old Aaron J. Aggins lived. Fed Aggins' daddy, among others. At the Al Brumfield Cemetery again. Can't see much. A lot of growth this time of year, even though the things are mowed. One last look at the Brumfield Cemetery, where many Brumfields are buried and their kin. But important to us now, James Toney. View of the Hearts Bridge and the mouth of Hearts from just below the Brumfield Cemetery. This would have all been cleared out now Brumfield's day. One final look at the Brumfield Cemetery. Then I've really got to go. Just can't get enough of this Al Brumfield Cemetery. At the Coal Branch Cemetery, beside the Coal Branch Church, looking for the grave of William Elias Rawls Fowler, an old school teacher. Can't find it yet, he may be unmarked. The Fowlers, Gillespies, and Toneys all intermarried, and then of course their descendants intermarried with a lot of other families. But we're focusing on the Fowlers, Toneys, and Gillespies here in the Hearts area right now on this tape. So we'll just make mention that Rawls Fowler's supposed to be here, but there's a lot of Agginses and Daltons, Dempseys, Brownings, and names like that. Traditional Coal Branch area names. Of course, the Brumfields also lived on Coal Branch, but they're all buried in the family cemetery across the creek there. Pretty big cemetery. Same cemetery as before. Coal Branch Cemetery, looking for the grave of Ross Fowler, an old school teacher. The date, November 25th, 1995. And we ain't finding him. Looking at Coal Branch from the cemetery across the creek. Bill Brumfield, my great-great-grandfather, who was half Toney and had Gillespie in him also, lived on Coal Branch with his wife Tiny, whose real name was Helena Aggins, daughter of Charlie Aggins, who married to Toney also. Bill and his wife were cousins. That's the old Bill Brumfield home place over there. Of course, that ain't the original. That's where it's sat, though. Right there. He was killed there by his own son. Road leading up behind it on the hill takes you to the Bill Brumfield Cemetery, where he's buried. Off the hill at Man's Knob Road, just a little piece off the blacktop. Down below in this bottom near the Orris Vance place and the end of Fred Kirk's property here probably is where Elijah Garton lived. Elijah Garton was the father of Isaac Griffith Garton, and Isaac Griffith Garton married to Toney, who was a half Gillespie. Pretty complicated once you got your charts to compare. Then over there by the Hardtop Road, where the woodpile is, straight up the hill, is where Elijah Garton's buried. His wife's buried somewhere else, though. Up Ramey Hollow here on Little Heart. But this is the old.
Yeah, I'd like to own this place.
Close, sold it once, one was done.
A little heart right there.
looking down Little Hearts Creek towards down below is Elmer Dingus's place, the mouth of Garten Fork, from the old Nancy Toney place. Most Toney later owned it, and I think he moved down off the hill though some. On a point here, big bottoms. This would probably been the orchard and the flower garden. Still on the Nancy Toney point. Up this way would have been the location of the house. Nancy Toney Point. Still looking towards where the house was, or perhaps having already passed it. Nancy Toney Point. Mose Toney, upon marrying, moved his family out here, where he kept them for a short while, and then eventually, I think, moved down off the hill into Bottoms. Location of the Nancy Toney house was right here in this flat.
You could, a few years ago, you could really feel.
Set right here. Flower garden nearby. Around the Nancy Toney house. The orchard started from the house about where this tree is. The old sled road that would have ran just below Nancy Toney's house out here. So even though we're out in the middle of nowhere now, back then we were on a main road almost. Grave of Aaron Aggins. Little Aaron Aggins on Man's Knob Cemetery. Man's Family Cemetery. He married Frances Toney, who was a half Gillespie. And they lived here on Little Heart. Aaron's house stood down at the mouth of Laurel Fork of Little Hearts Creek. His wife was raised at the mouth of Hearts, and when her daddy died, she moved with her brother Mose Toney up here on Little Heart and lived on in a home where we were just at. I was calling Nancy Toney Point. She lived out there. It ain't very far from here at all. Grave of Frances Toney Aggins. Married Aaron Aggins, Little Aaron Aggins. And she was the daughter of James and Nancy Gillespie Toney. Raised down at the mouth of Hearts. Brought up here to Little Heart as a child to live on Nancy Toney Point, which overlooks Elmer Dingus's place today. Her picture is in the Aggins book, and her husband, I have a copy of it, courtesy of Bill Aggins. Man's Family Cemetery on Man's Knob. Used to be called Garten Knob, because the Gartens owned it. Grave of Moses B. Toney, May 23rd, 1847 to April 23rd, 1901. He was the son of James and Nancy Gillespie Toney, and he was the only son out of that family. The rest were girls. And he has a lot of kinfolk down on Hearts and Ranger. His wife was Luverna Toney. They spelled Lieuvernia. She was illegitimate, went by Caldwell. Her birth date August 16th, 1858. She died March 16th, 1945. We haven't yet located a picture of these people, but we think we're going to have one soon. Again, the date, November 25th, 1995. Where the Gillespie would be buried. Again, up there's the grave of Aaron Aggins and his wife Frances, who was a Toney. And then you come on around a little further, there's the grave of Mose Toney. Mose and Frances were brother and sisters. And there's a lot of unmarked graves through here, and I'd say that Nancy Gillespie Toney is buried through here. Just a guess. We may find her yet. She would have died in the 1870s, I believe. So it'd be an old grave. Man's Cemetery out on Man's Knob. We are way up in the mountains here. Looking at where the Toneys seem to be buried, near the tree there, and there through there. It's primarily really a man's cemetery, that's for sure. There's lots of manses here. This is the grave of one of Moses' boys, Isaac Griffith Toney, named after Isaac Griffith Garton, old man Ike Garton, who married Moses' sister, Elizabeth Margaret Toney. The date's 1875 to 1940. Grave of James M. Toney, son of Mose, grandson of old James Toney, 1873 to 1963. His wife was Frances M. Toney, 1877 to 1959. Man's Cemetery, on our way out of here. Grave of General A. Toney, son of Mose Toney and grandson of James and Nancy Gillespie Toney. Born 1884, died in 1972. His wife Ida P. Toney, 1890 to 1937, and the stone beside of it gives her birthday as 1891 to 1937. So, whichever. At the Browning Cemetery, used to be called the Garton Cemetery, the head of Garton Fork. Find some Gartons here. Grave of Elizabeth Toney Garton. It says here born 1830, but that's not correct. And then she died February 13th, 1919. She was a daughter-in-law to Elijah Garton. She married Ike Garton and moved up here on Little Hart first, and her mother and her brother and sister followed later with their husbands and wives as they married. Mose Toney was her brother, among many others. She was one of the older girls in the family. And she married Isaac Griffith, or Ike Garton. Her middle name was Margaret, Elizabeth Margaret Garton. Susan Browning, daughter of Ike and Elizabeth Margaret Toney Garton. She married Elias Browning. Her birth date, June 22nd, 1864, and died August 1931. Her husband, Elias Browning, born December 4th, 1864, and died November 1930. Grave of Isaac Garton, Jr., born 1884, died 1922. Son of Ike and Elizabeth Toney Garton. Remember, Elizabeth Toney's half Gillespie. She's the daughter of James and Nancy Gillespie Toney from Mouth of Hearts. Caroline Garton, wife of Isaac Garton Jr., born 1874, died 1955. We think she may have been a fry. We aren't quite sure though. Again, at the Browning Cemetery, used to be called the Garton Cemetery. November 25th, 1995. Grave of Isaac Griffith Garton, Ike Garton. Says he was born 1832, died 1924. Not buried beside his wife, Elizabeth Margaret, because she died first and was buried on the other side of the cemetery. And they had to blast the ground too much for her. So whenever he told people where he wanted to be buried, he said not to blast over there around her and disturb her grave, and to put him over in this end of the cemetery. So he's over here with some fries. Beside of him, Henry Hardin Fry, born 1865, died 1946. And beside of him, Elizabeth A. Fry, born 1872, died 1967. Henry's wife. What was her maiden name?
Garten.
Garten. That's why they're
Ike's
here.
daughter.
Daughter of Isaac and Elizabeth Margaret Toney Garten. Grave of Martha Fry Keyser. Martha was the daughter of Henry Hardin and Elizabeth Garton Fry. She married Gerard Keyser. Odell Dingus has their photographs. Gerard, born 1886, died 1976. Martha, born 1888, and died 1976 also. The Garton Cemetery, today called the Browning Cemetery. Grave of Albert J. Sias and wife Edna, born 1898, died 1948. We aren't sure who they are yet, but we'll figure that out. Grave of Wildy Fry, Henry Hardin Fry's youngest boy.
Never married.
Never married. Born November 27, 1910, died July 14, 1978. Grave of Wildy. Sitting on top of Ferrellsburg Hill here, just across Route 10 from Ferrellsburg Bottom, the old Ferrellsburg Community Cemetery, looking at the grave of Polly Ann Fowler. Polly Ann Fowler was an Aggians. Her daddy was the original settler here around Ferrellsburg, and he was a slave owner and several other things. He came from Wayne County. Polly Ann's mother was a Fry, Susanna Fry. Daddy was Elias Aggians. Her husband was William T. Bill Fowler, which fits into the focus of this tape, the Gillespies, Fowlers, and Toneys, and their other families that they are married into and allied with. Her husband, William T. Fowler, was a son of I'm not sure, I've already forgotten that. Anyway, Bill Fowler's daddy was Thomas Fowler, and Thomas Fowler married Elizabeth Gillespie. And that's how we fit back in the Gillespies. It just occurred to me. To back way back up to the beginning of the tape, when Bill Agins and I were over in Boone County, we were looking for an old Gillespie cemetery. We were looking for the grave of Theophilus Gillespie, born around 1776. Theophilus married a woman named Mary Champe, or Mary Champ, C-H-A-M-P-E, and they had about 6 or 7 kids. 3 of those are important to this video. The first one was Elizabeth Gillespie, who married Thomas Fowler, and they had Bill Fowler, and Bill Fowler married the woman whose tombstone I'm filming now. The other daughter was Letty Gillespie, who married Moses Brown. And Moses Brown lived down at what's today known as Heartland Hall Road, or Brown's Branch, I mean. They didn't have any children, but they raised several of their nieces and nephews. The other child of Theophilus Gillespie was Nancy Jane Gillespie. Today is November 26th. Yesterday we were on Nancy Toney Point. Nancy Toney was this Gillespie before she married. And Nancy married James Toney and had Mose Toney and Elizabeth Toney and Ann Toney and a bunch of others that intermarried with a lot of the people around Harts here. So those 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Letty, and Nancy of Theophilus Gillespie, are really important for this video. And they all lived right here around Harts. So this is the first wife of Bill Fowler. Bill Fowler came here, married into the Agins family, and settled on what's called Fowler's Branch, which is just right over the hill behind this very grave, here in Ferrellsburg. So that's a little history on these Gillespies, that if you don't know who they are, you'll know who they are, sort of, and why we're filming them now, knowing that little bit of genealogy there. Again, this is the grave of Polly Ann Agins Fowler, first wife of Bill Fowler. Remember, Bill Fowler was ran out of Harts by Brumfields. He was burnt out, and instead of trying to fight back, he just left and went off and remarried and made a lot of money somewhere else. Some books show her middle name, this lady here, to be Polly Emerine Aggins instead of Polly Ann. In any case, this is her grave. It reads, Polly Ann, wife of W.T. Fowler, born October 12, 1830, died February 20th, 1860. And her parents, Elias and Susanna Fry Aggins, are very close by. Look at Frelsburg Bottom from the Frelsburg Cemetery. November 26th, 1995. Look at the Frelsburg Cemetery. Lots of Mullenses, Agginses, Brewsters, a little, farmers, and other families buried here. Through here, the older part of the cemetery where the old Agginses are buried who had intermarried with Frys, and of course the reason that we came up here and put this on the tape today with the Fowlers. There's the grave of Bill Fowler's first wife. Plain as day. Grave of Pleasant Bartram Fed or Fred Aggins. Born July 22nd, 1867. Died October 2nd, 1932. Fed Aggins figures into the Toney Gillespie family two ways. Three ways. His mother and father. His father was Aaron J. Aggins, and his mother was Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins. More on her in a minute. First, Fed's first wife was Elvira Sice, 1864 to 1901 by the tombstone marker. Elvira Sice's mother was Martha Rose Toney. Martha Rose Toney was a daughter of James and Nancy Gillespie Toney. That means this lady's was a niece to Mose Toney, Elizabeth Toney Garton, Ann Toney Brumfield, Mary Jane Toney Aggins, Frances Toney Aggins, Letty McKibben Toney Aggins, and all the other children of James and Nancy Toney. Remember, we were at the Nancy Toney Point yesterday on Little Heart. That was Fed's first wife. After she died, Fed chose for a wife Renda Susan Aggins. Renda was a Davis before marrying Fed. Her birth date, February 8th, 1885. Died November 4th, 1980. Renda descends through the Toneys also. I believe her grandmother was Enos Jake Aggins. Grandfather was, and her grandmother, Jake's wife, was Letty McKibben Toney Aggins. And Kib Toney, as she went by Kib Aggins, was a daughter of James and Nancy Toney also. And I believe that Jake was Rendy's grandparents. Rendy was a Davis. So these three graves figure into the Gillespie family, all three, each in their own way. Still here at the Harts Cemetery in Harts, West Virginia, November 26, 1995, looking at Gillespies and their descendants. Just to right exactly behind the Fed Aggins grave is the unmarked grave of Fed's daddy, Aaron J. Aggins, Civil War veteran, son of Elias and Susanna Fry Aggins. And Aaron was Fed's daddy. Aaron married and immediately buried to the side of him here in this unmarked grave behind Elvira Sias Aggins, Fed's first wife, is the grave of Fed's mother, Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins. Nancy Jane Gillespie did not descend through the same Gillespies that most of the Gillespie people around here did. Most come down in this area through Theophilus Gillespie, but Nancy descends through Theophilus' brother, Samuel Gillespie. Samuel Gillespie married Mary Jane McElwee, and her daddy was a brother to the old Theophilus Gillespie, whose grave we were trying to find in Boone County earlier on the tape. It's said that Nancy would visit her Gillespie and Toney and Fowler cousins and in-laws here, or cousins, and she was an eligible woman, and Aaron Aggins was an eligible bachelor, and their marriage was arranged by the families. And so she would come here. Her family really never came into this area. They all stayed in Boone County except her. This is the grave of Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins, Fed Aggins' mother. And again, right beside of her is her husband. And all about them in this cemetery are their other children. All the rest of their kids, again, to remind you, would be half Gillespies. And we may take a peek at them before we leave the cemetery. Grave of Aaron Aggins' boy, Major Aggins, unmarked, sits directly behind the grave of Pearl Aggins, Hart Cemetery. Grave of Margaret Aggins, daughter of Aaron and Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins, never married. It was said she took such good care of her brothers and sisters they wouldn't let her marry. They wanted all of her time to devote to them. Hart Cemetery. She's buried directly beside her mother, Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins. Not to be confused with the Nancy Jane Gillespie Toney. They're different people. Grave of Melissa Aggins. She married another Aggins from Wayne County, Burl Aggins, who's buried right to her right, right there. Melissa Aggins was the daughter of Aaron, Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins, and there are probably several others in the cemetery that I have yet to focus in on, and we may or may not find time for them. Hart Cemetery. Samuel Mack Aggins, son of Aaron J. Aggins and his wife Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins. Hart Cemetery. Look at some of the graves here in the Hart Cemetery. Standing at the grave of Mack Aggins, looking down the hill and turning about. My shadow there. And then looking up the hill where there are a lot of other graves. Grave of Virgie Jewel Workman Aggins, 1909 to 1989, and her husband William Clinton Aggins Sr., 1906, and he's still living. Today is November 26th, 1995. Hart Cemetery. William is the son of Fed Aggins and Randy Susan Davis Aggins. Hart Cemetery, wife of Isaac Aggins. Not really relevant to the Gillespies, but I'll get them while I'm up here. These are some old people. These are my direct ancestors. Husband Isaac Aggins. His brother was Elias Aggins. Shot of Hart's Bottom, coming off the Hart Cemetery. The sun's going to be in our eyes, but we'll try to get as best as we can. Bill Aggins' residence, Hart's Bottom, Hart's, West Virginia. 1995, November 26th. Old Ian Aggins' store, Hart's, West Virginia. His son Herb Aggins ran it for most of the time. Ian was killed when he was pretty young. Herb ran it from probably around 1919 on to his death in the 80s. Hart's Volunteer Fire Department, located near the old home of Aaron J. Aggins and his wife Nancy Jane Gillespie Aggins. Good Hart's. They would have had a house that I think stood and faced the river about right here. Just about where the fireplace sits now, or where the fire department sits now. Looking at the mouth of Hart's Creek, the old James Toney property. His house probably sat where the Al Brumfield house would sit in future years, right there in that bottom, right in there. Up on the hill is where James Toney is supposed to be buried, in the Al Brumfield cemetery. He would have owned most of that property. Probably someone up the creek. James Toney married into Gillespie. Nancy Jane Gillespie. Mouth of Hart's, November 26, 1995. Actual mouth of Big Hart's Creek as it feeds into the Guyandotte River. Hart's, West Virginia, November 26th, 1995. A lot of action went around the mouth of this creek at one. Just back of the Hart's Volunteer Fire Department. Again, in this bottom here, is where the old Aaron Aggins home place stood. His wife was Nancy Jane Gillespie, daughter of Samuel Gillespie. And they would have lived right up there somewhere in a big old log cabin that faced the river. Present day view of the Guyandotte River at the mouth of Hart's, from about where the old Aaron J. Aggins and Nancy Jane Gillespie home place would have been. Of course, in their day, it probably would have been totally cleared out without the garbage. Probably a lovely view here. View of where the old James Toney place probably stood, or about the Aaron Aggins home place site. Close neighbors, just across the river. Both married Gillespie women, and the Gillespie women were cousins. Both women were named Nancy Jane Gillespie.
Naomi Davis, Naomi Messer, too. It'll be her. I don't know who this is. This may be on.
At the old Jake Aggins Cemetery up Douglas Branch near Furlsburg. Looking down at the old Jake Aggins home place site, even though his home place is probably long gone. It's said, according to Billy Aggins, exactly where that house right there does. Exactly. And look at the cemetery. Grave of Enos Jake Aggins, born February 28, 1830, died February 28, 1907. Died on his birthday. Went by the nickname of Jake. He was the son of Elias and Susanna Fry Aggins, and he married into the Toney family. He married his daughter James and Nancy Gillespie Toney. Her name was Letty McKibben Toney, and she was Aggins after marriage. Her birthday on the stone is 1835 to 1903, but her birth date's incorrect by other records. Should have been around 1830. Cemetery located on Douglas Branch near Ferrellsburg, Lincoln County, November 26, 1995.
They burned it back over there to that guy.
Another shot of the Jake Aggins grave. And to its left, going this way, it's the grave of his daughter, Anne Frances Aggins Davis. She married Giles Davis. And immediately then to her left, grave of Giles Davis. You can recognize them by these type of stones here laying flat on the ground. The other one isn't quite so easy to spot. She also has one. Again, this is the grave of Anne beside of her parents. She was part Toney and her grandmother was a Gillespie. Her husband was a Davis, Giles Davis. And together they parented all the Davis people around here. Giles Davis, Jake Aggins Cemetery, Douglas Branch. Grave of Emma Jane Hager Aggins, daughter of Philip Hager. Married one of Jake Aggins' boys, Albert G. Aggins. First time. They had no kids. She died, and Albert remarried into the Hugh Dingus clan. He married Mary E. Brooke Dingus. And they were the parents of Bob Aggins of Hamlin. Again, the name Emma Jane Aggins, born October 4th, 1866, died January 21st, 1901. She's all the way up top of the cemetery by herself. And none of Albert's family is buried here alongside of her. They're all down the other end of the hill. I guess they were saving room up here for them. But Albert's buried over in Hamlin with his second wife, Brooke Dingus. Emma Jane Aggins' grave. All the way down, away from her and everybody else, are the rest of the graves. Down the hill. Grave of Ed Dingus. Married Clementine or Tyne Aggins. She was the daughter of Jake and Letty McKibben Toney Aggins. Jake Aggins Cemetery, Douglas Branch near Ferrellsburg, November 26, 1995. It looks like he was born November of 1889, died November of 1907. The dates of death aren't very readable. But I'll film them, maybe you can tell what they are, whoever's watching. He may have been born 1869. So I'll read it one more time on what I think it says. Ed Dingus, born November perhaps 10th, 1869. Died November. Dates you can't read the days. 1909. Make that 1907. This is kind of hard work, guys. Hard to read sometimes. We do our best. Jake Aggins Cemetery. Another shot of the old Jake Aggins home site. We don't think that's his old original house, though. We really doubt it. It's up this hollow that Al Brumfield came and slept after the Haley McCoy murders in 1889. After visiting with his grandpa Jake, not his grandpa, his his Uncle Jake. He was afraid some of his enemies' friends would find him and trap him in Jake's house, so he came up the hollow here and slept under a beech tree that night, and he went on home the next day. Looking down Douglas Branch from the cemetery. Looking down at the creek from the Jake Aggins Cemetery, Douglas Branch. Al Brumfield would have came up this creek here. There wasn't a road here then probably, and went all the way to the head and probably slept. The road today goes right up that way. Douglas Branch. Side of the old Jake Aggins home. Grave of William E. Jake Fowler, 1885 to 1967. He was the son of William Elias Ross Fowler, whose grave we couldn't find earlier on the tape, and the grandson of Bill Fowler and Polly Aggins, whose grave we found earlier on the tape down at Ferrellsburg. We're standing up here up behind the residence of the old Carmel Mitchell place near Harts High School. Jake Fowler married Lula Vance, who was raised by Keenan and Arena Saunders Farrell, the two people who the town of Ferrellsburg is named after. Her birth date 1894, died 1985. Grave of Guy C. Fowler, June 9, 1915, November 29, 1978, son of Jake Fowler. And remember, old man Bill Fowler, Guy's great-grandfather, and Jake over here's grandfather, had Gillespie. I think he was part Gillespie, so that's why we're here. Fowlers, Gillespies, and Toneys, and all the families they've intermarried with here around Harts. Again, this is Jake Fowler, son of old Ross Fowler, William Elias Ross Fowler, whose daddy Bill Fowler is who Fowler Branch is named for down in Ferrellsburg. And we're on a hill behind the old Carmel Mitchell place, which is being torn down now and replaced by a trailer. His wife Irene Fowler Mitchell lives here, and she's a daughter of Jake and Lula Fowler. Opal Fowler, September 8, 1918, January 28, 1972. Daughter of Jake Fowler. William Bill Fowler, son of Jake Fowler, June 19, 1913 to August 23, 1981. Grave of Frank D. Fowler, January 16, 1936 to April 25, 1983. Son of Jake Fowler. The Jake Fowler Cemetery, November 26, 1995. Grave of Carmel Mitchell, married Irene Fowler, Jake's daughter. She lives down below us in a trailer. This is the Jake Fowler Cemetery, November 26, 1995. That's every grave here up to this point. Charlie Brumfield Cemetery, behind Charles Brumfield's Sunoco gas station, Harts, West Virginia.